The silver necklace didn't just burn my sister's neck. It sizzled like a steak on a hot grill. I can still smell the scorched hair and the copper tang of her blood. My sister Sarah, the person who held my hand at our mother's funeral, is currently locked in the kitchen pantry, and she's scratching at the wood with fingernails that are way too long to be human. I have exactly 4 hours until the sun comes up and the bulldozers arrive to level this house. But I'm not leaving. Not yet. Because I just looked behind the master mirror in the attic, and I found the real Thorne family. They aren't dead. They're translucent, skeletal, and still breathing behind the glass. And they're looking at me like I'm the one who put them there. I thought I came back to Savannah to save my inheritance. Now, I'm just trying to figure out why my own reflection in the hallway didn't blink when I did. Let me take you back to where this began. Sweat stung Elias's eyes, mixing with the grit of pulverized lime and the cloying, heavy scent of overripe jasmine that seemed to choke the Savannah air. He gripped the gilded edges of the floor-length mirror, his knuckles white against the tarnished velvet draping the glass. The heavy oak frame groaned under the strain. With a sharp grunt, he heaved the monolith across the limestone terrace, the screech of wood against stone echoing through the empty Thorne estate like a dying bird. One more. Only one more before the iron gates groaned open for Sarah. He wrestled the final mirror toward the garden shed, his breath hitching in shallow, jagged bursts. The velvet slipped. For a heartbeat, a sliver of silvered glass caught the bruised purple of the twilight sky. Elias lunged, pinning the fabric down with a trembling forearm. He refused to glimpse his own reflection. People in town claimed the humidity caused the hallucinations, the Savannah fever. But Elias recognized the ripple in the glass for what it was: a hunger. The mirrors didn't just show you the world, they drank it. He shoved the mirror into the darkness of the shed, slamming the heavy bolt home. The metal handle burned his palm, a searing heat that made him hiss. Silence descended, thick and suffocating like the moss hanging from the live oaks. He stood there for a moment, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had scrubbed the house bare, leaving only shadows and dull wood. Sarah would be safe as long as the house remained blind. The air felt like a wet wool blanket, 92 degrees even, with the sun dipping below the horizon. Elias wiped his hands on his trousers, the fabric rough against his skin. He had to be sure. He turned back toward the house, his eyes scanning the windows. They looked like empty sockets. Good. If there was no reflection, there was no gateway. He started toward the back porch, counting his steps under his breath. 2, 4, 6, 8. He reached the door on 28, an even number, a safe number. As long as the world remained divisible by 2, he wasn't alone. He wasn't the only thing left. Inside, the house smelled of sandalwood incense and something else. Something metallic, like a copper penny resting on the tongue. It was the smell of the Thorne legacy, a scent that had haunted his dreams in Chicago for a decade. He moved through the foyer, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. The walls were scarred with pale rectangles where the portraits had hung. He had taken them all down. He wouldn't let the painted eyes of his ancestors watch Sarah walk through the door. He made his way toward the basement door, the wood cool under his touch. The stairs creaked as he descended. 2, 4, 6. He reached the bottom on 12. He needed answers before the taxi reached the drive. He needed to know why his grandmother Eleanor had spent her final years screaming at her own reflection. The basement was a labyrinth of crates and forgotten trunks. Dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight, thick enough to taste. He reached the center of the room, where the floorboards felt loose. He knelt, the grit of the cellar floor biting into his knees. With a crowbar he'd left leaning against a pillar, he wedged the metal tip into a seam of the heavy oak boards. He heaved. The wood shrieked, a sound like bones snapping. Beneath the floor lay a cavity lined with rotting silk. And there, nestled in the center, was a leather-bound journal. The leather was cracked, smelling of old salt and damp earth. He pulled it out, his fingers trembling. The cover was embossed with a date, 1954. He flipped the pages, the paper brittle and yellowed. His eyes caught a phrase written in a cramped, frantic hand. The Great Exchange. The words seemed to vibrate on the page. He read further, his breath hitching. The glass demands a vessel. To keep the fortune, the blood must be traded. One soul for the harvest, one shadow for the street. It wasn't a diary. It was a ledger of a ritual, a blood sacrifice. He realized with a jolt of ice in his veins that his grandmother hadn't been crazy. She had been replaced. The woman who had raised him, who had scrubbed her hands until they bled, was a mimic. A floorboard groaned above him, not the house settling. A footstep. Elias froze, his pulse thudding in his ears. He shoved the journal into his waistband, his hand reaching for the heavy brass lamp on the nearby workbench. The air in the basement suddenly turned cold, the smell of scorched dust filling his nose. From the shadows of the rafters, something moved. Not a man. Not exactly. A shape, draped in a heavy, hooded gray coat, dropped with a sickening thud onto the dirt floor. It didn't breathe. It didn't grunt. It just lunged. A rusty fire poker whistled through the air, narrowly missing Elias's temple. He threw himself sideways, crashing into a stack of empty crates. The wood splintered, needles of pine piercing his palms. The intruder was fast, moving with a jerky, mechanical efficiency that defied gravity. Elias swung the brass lamp. It connected with the side of the intruder's head with a dull thwack, like a hammer hitting a side of beef. The man didn't cry out. He stumbled back, the hood falling away to reveal a face that looked like it had been molded from wet clay. Features slightly blurred, eyes a shade too wide and unblinking. It was Miller, the gardener, but his skin looked like gray parchment. They grappled on the floor, the scent of old blood and wet earth filling Elias's lungs. The intruder's grip was like iron bands, crushing the breath from his chest. Elias felt the cold bite of the fire poker against his throat. He bucked, his boots kicking up clouds of dust, and managed to shove the man back into a heavy shelving unit. The shelves collapsed. Tons of old mason jars and iron tools rained down on the intruder. A heavy crate of lead weights pinned the man's legs, a sickening crunch echoing through the cellar. The intruder finally let out a sound, a high-pitched electronic whine that set Elias's teeth on edge. Elias scrambled back, his chest heaving. He grabbed the lamp again, ready to strike. But the figure remained pinned, its gray eyes fixed on him with a terrifying, vacant intensity. Elias didn't wait. He turned and sprinted for the stairs. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. He slammed the basement door and turned the deadbolt. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely stand. He leaned against the wood, the vibration of the intruder's rhythmic pounding against the door beneath him, thrumming through his spine. The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway snapped him out of his terror. A car door slammed, then another. Elias wiped the blood from a cut on his forehead, trying to smooth his hair. He had to act normal. He had to protect Sarah. He pulled his shirt cuffs down, hiding the raw scrapes on his wrists, and walked toward the front door. The porch lights flickered, a rhythmic pulse every 4 seconds. 1, 2, 3, blink. He opened the heavy oak door just as Sarah reached the top step. Elias, she cried, her voice bright and melodic. You look like you've seen a ghost, you know? She looked perfect. Her hair was a honey blonde bob, her dress a crisp navy linen that defied the Savannah humidity. Beside her stood David, her husband, a man with a jawline like a cliffside and a handshake that Elias knew would be a second too long. "Welcome home, Sarah," Elias said, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. He stepped forward to hug her, but as he moved, his eyes caught the light glinting off the silver necklace around her neck. It was a delicate chain with a small locket. As Sarah leaned in, the silver locket swung forward, brushing against the bare skin of her collarbone. Sarah didn't just flinch. She shrieked. It was a sound of pure, visceral agony, like a hot iron pressing into raw meat. She recoiled, her hand flying to her throat as if to tear the necklace away. For a split second, the skin where the silver had touched turned a bruised, bubbling purple, the flesh puckering and hissing. "Sarah," Elias gasped, reaching out. She recovered instantly, the pageant smile snapping back into place, though her eyes remained wide and glassy. "Oh, it's just the heat, you know. The metal gets so hot in the sun, you know. My skin is just so sensitive today, you know." She tucked the necklace under her collar, her fingers trembling. David stepped forward, his knuckles cracking in a rapid-fire sequence, thumb, index, middle, ring, pinky. The sound was loud in the quiet evening air. "Good to see you, Elias," David said, his voice a booming baritone that felt like a physical weight. He clapped a heavy hand on Elias's shoulder, his grip tightening until the bone groaned. "You've been busy. The house looks empty." Elias looked from David to Sarah. The way they stood, too still, their breathing not quite synced with the rhythm of the room. The smell of the basement was still on him, but the smell coming off them was worse. It was the smell of a brand new car. Plastic, chemicals, and a void where a human scent should be. "I had to clear out the rot," Elias said, his voice steadying. "Grandmother left a lot of baggage." "Well, it won't matter much longer," David said, walking past Elias into the foyer. He didn't look at the empty walls. He looked at the floorboards, as if calculating their board footage. "I've already handled the paperwork. We signed the contract this morning. The developers are bringing the bulldozers in at dawn. This whole place is going to be a luxury condo complex by next year." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. "You sold it? Without telling me?" "You've been unstable, Elias," David said, turning back with a cold, unblinking stare. "The accident in Chicago, it changed you. We figured it was best to handle the great exchange of property ourselves. You need rest, not a crumbling mausoleum." Elias felt the leather journal pressing against his spine. The great exchange. David had used the exact phrase from the journal. "You can't sell it," Elias whispered. "There's something in the foundation, something in the glass." David laughed, a short, barking sound. "See? This is what I told Sarah. You're seeing shadows again. It's just grief, Elias. Just a psychological breakdown. We're going to get you help. But first, we're going to get this house leveled." Elias backed away, his mind racing. He needed to get back to the basement. He needed to show them, or find a way to stop them. He looked at Sarah. She was standing by the stairs, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her eyes fixed on the spot where the hallway mirror used to be. "It's so quiet in here, you know," she whispered. "The house feels blind, you know." "I'm going to check the kitchen," Elias said, his voice tight. "I'll make some tea." He retreated into the back of the house, his heart hammering. He needed a weapon, He needed proof. He stepped into the kitchen, the linoleum cold under his feet. The air here was freezing, a sharp contrast to the sweltering heat outside. In the corner, by the back door, he saw Buster. The family's golden retriever was standing perfectly still. The dog didn't wag its tail. It didn't bark. It was standing with its legs locked, its head tilted back so far its eyes were rolled into its skull, showing only the whites. "Buster?" Elias whispered. He reached out to touch the dog's flank. The fur was covered in a fine layer of frost. The animal was solid, like a block of ice carved into the shape of a dog. The kitchen door behind him slammed shut with a force that rattled the copper pots hanging from the ceiling. The temperature plummeted. Elias could see his own breath blooming in front of him in white, ragged clouds. He was always such a loud dog, you know. Elias spun around. Sarah was standing by the island. But she wasn't the Sarah who had stepped out of the car. Her jaw had unhinged, her mouth stretching wider than any humans could. Her movements were jerky, like a film skipping frames. She skittered across the floor, her limbs elongating, her fingers tapering into sharp, translucent points. "You shouldn't have hidden the mirrors, Elias," she hissed, her voice a distorted echo of his sister's. "The harvest is hungry, you know." She lunged. Elias grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the counter and swung. The metal connected with her shoulder, but instead of a thud, there was a sound like a wet sponge hitting a wall. She didn't slow down. She pinned him against the refrigerator, her cold, damp hands wrapping around his throat. Her skin felt like wet silicone. "Where's the journal, Elias? Where did you put the ledger?" Elias struggled, his vision blurring as her grip tightened. He reached out, his hand fumbling across the counter until he found a jar of salt. He smashed it against her face. The mimic shrieked, the white crystals searing her skin like acid. She recoiled, her face puckering into a mass of gray, bubbling welts. Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed her by the shoulders and shoved her with every ounce of strength he had toward the walk-in pantry. She tripped over her own elongated feet, tumbling into the dark closet. Elias slammed the heavy oak door and threw the iron bolt. The screeching that came from behind the wood was unlike anything human. A high-pitched, vibrating wail that made the glassware in the cupboards shatter. The door shuddered under the force of her blows, the wood groaning, but the bolt held. Elias slumped against the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was alone in the kitchen, with a frozen dog and a monster in the closet. He looked at his hands. They were covered in a gray, slimy residue. He had to know. He had to see what was behind the blindness he had created. He ran back into the hallway, toward the one mirror he hadn't moved. A small, decorative piece built into the mahogany paneling of the coat closet. He took a screwdriver from his pocket and began to frantically scrape at the silver backing of the glass. The silver flakes fell like toxic snow. As the coating vanished, the glass didn't reveal the wood behind it. It revealed a void. Elias pressed his face toward the clear pane. Beyond the glass, there was no wall. There was a vast, pressurized darkness, a dimension that smelled of old ozone and stagnant water. And then he saw them. Dozens of figures were suspended in the gloom. They were emaciated, their skin so translucent he could see the faint, pulsing glow of their organs. They were tethered to the glass by thin, silver umbilical cords. He recognized them. The real Sarah. The real Miller. And in the center, a skeletal, vengeful figure draped in moth-eaten black silk. Elias Thorne. The real Eleanor wasn't dead. She was the architect. She was presiding over a farm. The mimics weren't just replacements. They were a crop. The estate was a factory, processing human lives into perfect, hollow copies to be sent back out into the world. The skeletal Eleanor turned her head. Her eyes were pits of absolute darkness. She saw him. She lunged toward the glass, her withered hands clawing at the barrier. A scream erupted from her throat, a sound that didn't travel through the air, but vibrated directly into Elias's brain. The mirror began to crack. Spiders of white light raced across the surface as the pressure from the other side built. The house began to groan, the very foundations shifting as the barrier between dimensions started to fail. Elias, what have you done? David was standing at the end of the hallway. He wasn't the confident architect anymore. His skin was flickering, his features blurring and resetting like a corrupted video file. You're one of them, Elias whispered, backing away from the cracking mirror. You've been one of them for years. I'm the one who kept the cycle going, David roared, his voice distorting into a metallic growl. He cracked his knuckles. Crack, 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 crack. I brought you home for the final harvest. You were the last piece, Elias. The new Elias was supposed to be the masterpiece. The storm finally broke outside. A crack of lightning illuminated the house, followed by a boom of thunder that shook the floorboards. The power died instantly, plunging the hallway into a thick, suffocating darkness. Elias didn't wait for David to move. He turned and sprinted for the stairs. He had to get to the attic. The journal had mentioned a master mirror, the anchor for the entire estate. If he could destroy it, maybe he could close the gate. 2, 4, 6, 8. He stumbled on the 12th step, his heart hammering. He could hear David behind him, the sound of heavy, wet footsteps dragging across the carpet. He reached the second-floor landing and scrambled toward the attic pull-down ladder. He hauled himself up into the cramped, dusty space. The air here was thick with the scent of kerosene and old paper. In the center of the room stood the master mirror. It was 10 feet tall, framed in blackened silver that looked like twisted vines. The surface wasn't glass. It was a swirling pool of liquid mercury. Elias grabbed a heavy sledgehammer he'd left near the chimney. He raised it over his head, his muscles screaming, "Don't do it, Elias." David was there, standing in the shadows of the eaves. He looked more like a man now, his mask reinforced by the proximity to the master mirror. He held a heavy iron bar. "You don't understand what you are," David said, his voice soft, almost pitying. "You think you're the hero? You think you came back from Chicago to save your family?" "I'm ending this," Elias spat. "You're not ending anything. You're just a delivery." David stepped into a shaft of moonlight. The original Elias Thorne died 10 years ago. He died in that car accident with your parents. We couldn't let the Thorne line end. We needed a vessel that could survive the outside world. A perfected mimic. One with real memories, real emotions. "You're lying," Elias whispered, his grip on the sledgehammer slipping. "Am I?" "Check the alignment, Elias. Count the steps." David lunged. They collided in the center of the attic. The struggle was brutal, a frantic exchange of blows in the dark. Elias felt the iron bar smash into his ribs, the pain white and blinding. He swung the sledgehammer, catching David in the chest, sending him sprawling back toward the open balcony door. The wind howled through the opening, rain lashing at the floorboards. Elias followed, his movements fueled by a desperate primal rage. He tackled David, and they tumbled onto the rain-slicked balcony. The stone railing was cold and slick. David clawed at Elias's face, his fingers cold as ice. Elias shoved him back, his boot connecting with David's chest. David's body hit the railing. The old stone gave way. Elias watched as David fell into the darkness of the garden below. There was no scream, just a sickening thud as he impacted the stone fountain. In the next flash of lightning, Elias saw David's body. It didn't look like a man. It looked like a pile of shattered gray porcelain. Elias slumped against the doorway, the rain soaking through his shirt. He was alive. He had won. He turned back toward the master mirror, the sledgehammer heavy in his hand. He just needed to break it. Then it would all be over. A flash of lightning illuminated the attic, brighter than any before. In that split second of brilliant white light, Elias caught his reflection in a discarded shard of glass leaning against a trunk. He froze. The light had caught his back. He saw his own spine reflected in the jagged silver. Running the entire length of his back, from the nape of his neck to the base of his spine, was a neat, surgical seam. The skin was held together by fine, silver threads, the flesh around it perfectly smooth and hairless. It wasn't a scar. It was a seal. The sledgehammer slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. He reached back, his trembling fingers finding the seam. It felt cold. It felt like plastic. The memories hit him then, not as thoughts, but as a flood of data. The accident in Chicago. The hospital room that had no windows. The doctors who never blinked. The way he had been programmed with the count. The ritual of the stairs, to keep his consciousness tethered to a body that wasn't his. He wasn't the survivor. He was the product. Elias. The voice came from the master mirror. The liquid surface rippled, and the skeletal Elias Thorne stepped through. She wasn't a monster now. She looked like the grandmother from his memories, kind, maternal, her skin soft as parchment. "You're home, my sweet boy," she whispered, reaching out with a hand that was translucent in the moonlight. The new Elias, the perfect version, the one who can walk among them and never be suspected. Elias backed away, his heart, or the mechanical pump that served as one, stuttering in his chest. I'm not real. You are more real than any of us," Eleanor said, her voice a soothing hum. "You have the emotions. You have the soul code. You are the future of the Thorne legacy. Now come, let the harvest begin. We have so many more cities to reach." Elias looked at his hands. They were turning pale, the skin becoming translucent, revealing the silver wires and pulsing blue fluid beneath. He felt the hunger then, the deep, hollow craving to be seen, to be reflected, to consume. He looked at the kerosene lanterns lining the attic walls. He looked at the master mirror, the gateway to a factory of lies. He had been programmed to survive. He had been programmed to lead. But he had also been programmed with his mother's kindness, or at least the memory of it. "No," Elias whispered. He reached out and kicked the nearest kerosene lantern. The glass shattered. The flame licked the dry floorboards, fueled by the spilled oil. "What are you doing?" Eleanor shrieked, her form flickering back into a skeletal wraith. Elias didn't answer. He moved through the attic, kicking over every lantern, every lamp. The fire spread with a hungry roar, the ancient wood of the estate devouring the flames. He watched the master mirror crack as the heat intensified. The spirits behind the glass began to scream, not in agony, but in a terrifying collective release. "We are the embroidery on the shroud," Eleanor wailed, her form dissolving into smoke. Elias stood in the center of the inferno, the heat searing his mimic flesh. He felt the soul code within him twisting, the fabricated memories melting away. But in their place, he felt something else. Choice. He turned and ran for the balcony. He leapt over the railing, his body hitting the wet grass of the garden with a jarring thud. He scrambled to his feet and ran toward the iron gates. Behind him, the Thorne estate was a pillar of orange and red, the fire lighting up the Savannah sky like a second sun. The screams of the mimics were drowned out by the roar of the collapsing roof. He reached his car and fumbled for the keys. He looked back once. In the distance, he saw a shape moving away from the fire. A woman in a navy linen dress, her honey blonde hair glowing in the firelight. Sarah, the new Sarah. She had escaped. She was already heading toward the highway, toward Atlanta. Elias gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He was a monster. He was a lie. But he was free. An hour later, he pulled into a roadside diner on the outskirts of the city. The sign flickered. 24 hours. He walked into the restroom, his movements stiff and mechanical. He stood before the cracked mirror above the sink and turned on the tap. The water was cold, washing the soot and ash from his face. He looked at his reflection. His eyes were a shade too bright. His skin was too perfect. And when he blinked, his reflection stayed open for a fraction of a second longer. He didn't feel horror. He leaned in, his fingers tracing the surgical seam on the back of his neck. He felt the power of the new Elias pulsing through him, the predatory precision, the infinite patience. He had burned the farm, but the crop had already been harvested. He walked back into the diner and sat at the counter. A waitress with cherry-red hair approached him, her eyes tired and kind. "Coffee, honey?" she asked, her voice a soft, southern drawl. "Yes, please," Elias said. He gave her a perfect, practiced smile, the kind of smile that made people feel safe. "And maybe a map. I'm heading to the city." "Atlanta?" she asked, pouring the coffee. "Beyond that," Elias said. He watched his reflection in the polished chrome of the coffee urn. It didn't move. It just watched him back. "I think I'm going to start a family." He took a sip of the coffee. It tasted like plastic and copper. He smiled again, wider this time. He was the ultimate evolution of the Thorne bloodline. He was the perfect American man, with a stolen name and a hollow heart. And the world was waiting to be reflected. The end.